Hi Y12, so this is video 2 on the biographer, annotating stanzas 3 and 4. So in these stanzas the persona is trying to kind of walk in the footsteps of Dickens in a hope to be inspired or to kind of understand what his life was like, or perhaps even to try to kind of be like Dickens, to emulate him. And we'll just start by reading those two stanzas. So how close can I get to the sound of your voice, which Emma Elizabeth Hibbert described, lively, eager and lightly pitched, with none of that later bitter edge. Cockney a little, in London town the faces you wrote leer and gape and plead at my feet. Once high in Hungerford Bridge, a stew and tangle of rags, sniffed by a dog, stood, spoke, spat at the shadow I cast, at the meagre shadow I cast in my time. I heard the faraway bells of St. Paul's as I ran. Maestro, monster, mummy's boy, my main man. I write you and write you for 5 hard years. I have an affair with a thespian girl. You would have approved. Then I snivel home to my wife, her poems and jam, her forgiveness, her violent love. And this is a life. I print it out. In all of your mirrors my face, with its smallish, its quizzical eyes, its cheekbones, its sexy jaw, its talentless dust jacket smile. So you can hear in those stanzas that you have some of the same kind of disregard for the persona's status compared to Dickens, and also some of the similar self-loathing that you see in these first two stanzas. So thinking about the end of this page, the beginning of stanza 3, what the persona is doing is using the words, the bits in italics are the words of this fictional biographer of Dickens. Emma Elizabeth Hibbert isn't actually a Dickens biographer. Carol Ann Duffy's just made up this person to use. And then 3 lines of the poem, all the bits in italics, are the words of this other biographer. So in terms of what that symbolises, it's back up to this idea that in stanza 1, the persona only manages to quote Dickens. And here he can't even use his own words to describe Dickens, he's just directly quoting somebody else. So it shows his lack of confidence in his own ability as a writer, just in terms of the number of lines out of the whole poem that actually come from somebody else. So I'm just going to make that point about the persona showing kind of lack of confidence. So the persona lacks confidence. But then I'm also going to think about the words that he quotes from this other biographer, because there's a bit of significance in those. So this fictional biographer of Dickens describes him as lively, eager and lightly pitched, with none of the later bitter edge. Now we can see those adjectives, so lively, eager, lightly pitched, phrasal adjective, later bitter edge, later and bitter adjectives, edge noun phrase. We can see these adjectives, so adjectives and noun phrase, as symbolic of the biographer himself. Now they're symbolic because he begins in this poem as lively and eager. If you think back, he caresses the desk, he stares at the picture, he's excited by the prospect of chronicling Dickens' life. So he is lively and eager, but he becomes bitter as the poem progresses. He becomes angry at the thought that Dickens wouldn't have noticed him or needed him. So the words used by this fictional biographer to describe Dickens actually seem to symbolise the poetic voice in this poem. So symbolic of the biographer's, just to continue that, descent into bitterness and disillusion. So the bitterness that he doesn't match up to, I'm just going to put that in yellow, the bitterness that he doesn't live up to Dickens. So there's some nice mirroring there of the poetic voice and Dickens. And then we just finish that description with him being called Cockney, but it's not too significant. And then this is when the poetic voice goes to London. So in London town, the faces you wrote leer and gape and plead at my feet. So he's in London and he's walking around looking, kind of walking the streets that Dickens would have walked in the East End of London. And he sees faces of people, these kind of East Enders. The faces you wrote, so Dickens is known for doing really good character description. But rather than smiling out at the persona, they leer and gape and plead at his feet. So 3 verbs in that syndetic list. All are creating the image that when the persona attempts to be like Dickens, something is wrong. These faces that Dickens created, the faces that the characters he described of these Londoners, are rejecting the persona because he is not as good as Dickens, he can't ever be Dickens, so they're leering and gaping and pleading. So there's a rejection of the poetic voice. And this is obviously, that's his interpretation of what he sees. He is so, he has such an inferiority complex about himself that this is how he imagines people are rejecting him. So all of this is a reflection of how he views himself. So he has, we've said it before, but he has an inferiority complex, which is coming through here. Rather than being embraced by the world of Dickens, he views it as rejecting him. So, rejected by Dickens' world. Okay. And then he gives another example of walking somewhere that Dickens described. So once high in Hungerford Bridge, a stew and tangle of rags, sniffed by a dog, stood, spoke, spat at the shadow I cast, the mere shadow I cast in my time. So hopefully you can hear the, gosh, mine's gone blank. What am I trying to say? The sibilants, there we are. Throughout this line, the stew, rags, sniffed, stood, spoke, spat, shadow, cast. Really, really heavy on its sibilant sounds there. And the sheer number of sibilant sounds create the sense of almost a kind of spitting, like a kind of distaste for what he's seen. So he's describing there a homeless person, that noun phrase, stew and tangle of rags, is supposed to describe a homeless person. And this homeless person has stood up and spat at him. So it's another image of him being rejected by Dickens' London, but it's written with such heavy sibilants and also some fricatives at the end that it has a kind of spitting sound, like he describes, which mirrors that total distaste he has for himself and London. And then you'll notice that he repeats this symbol of himself as a shadow. So the homeless person spat at the shadow I cast, at the mere shadow I cast in my time. So that is a symbol, it's a metaphor, it's a bit of both. And it's a metaphor for his lack of success. He is merely a shadow to Dickens. The phrase "in my time" is often used to describe writers, so either famous in their time, ignored in their time, and it describes how they experience their fame or their lack of fame when they were alive. Often writers are posthumously famous. It's once they're dead that people notice them. So he's describing himself here as a shadow of Dickens, something insignificant, not making a proper impact on the world. So he's a shadow of Dickens. And again, this tells us about the self-loathing, really, that I think is starting to come through in the poetic voice. Think how similar this is to captain of the blah-de-blah-de-blah, top of the form team. Very similar poetic voices. And then next bit I want you to think about is this final line. I heard the faraway bells of St. Paul's. I think that's pretty reminiscent of aspects of nostalgia. We're describing the church bells. What is this perhaps telling us about time, do you think? Or do you think that the bells of St. Paul's Cathedral might be symbolising something else here? And I'm going to think about this final word. I heard the faraway bells of St. Paul's as I ran. So he ends the poem, he ends the stanza on this verb, running. And I think this is a symbol of him attempting to escape the shadow that Dickens has cast over his life. By being Dickens' biographer, he is just constantly living in the shadow of a greater man. And this verb, ran, is a symbol of him trying to escape that shadow. So, attempt to escape the shadow of Dickens. Because kind of simultaneously he's saying that he is like a shadow, i.e. he's insignificant and not fully formed, but there is also a shadow cast over him by this other and greater writer. So you think about the faraway bells of St. Paul's. Okay, so onto the final stanza. He describes Dickens as a maestro, a monster, a mummy's boy, and then my main man. So we can see again really deliberate alliteration of this quite hard M sound. And this is one that, an alternative one you could think about. I hadn't kind of highlighted it as one that I wanted you to think about, but you might have a slightly different view of this than me. The use of this alliteration to me is, it reads as like an attempt for the poetic voice to show his skill, like his skill in being able to craft language in such a way that it becomes alliterative. I think this is an attempt to show that he has something kind of approaching the skill of Dickens as a writer. So I think, to me, this reads as an attempt to almost impress with his talent, with his skill. Again, similar to Captain, the poetic voice and Captain of the top of the form team. So I guess it's about the status of the poetic voice, attempting to have some status. And then he says, I write you and write you for 5 hard years. So he's just describing his attempt to chronicle the life of Dickens. And it clearly doesn't come easy to him. He describes it as hard. And then he says, I have an affair with a thespian girl, so someone from the theatre. You would have approved. Then I snivel home to my wife. So Dickens was known as quite a notorious kind of ladies' man. Very unfaithful to his wife, and that was part of his reputation, which I think is possibly what's being alluded to in that description of him there, as behaving in a monstrous way. And the poetic voice is attempting to mirror that kind of masculinity by having an affair, but then he undermines that by saying that he snivels home to his wife. So that verb there, snivel, really communicates a sense of weakness, that he attempts to live the life of this great literary hero, and he attempts to kind of project a sense of masculinity, but it is insignificant, ultimately he is weak and he will snivel home. So there is still that inferiority when compared to Dickens. And then he describes his wife, her poems and jam, her forgiveness, her violent love, and this is a life. Again, very similar to the end of Captain, where he's really quite dismissive of his wife. Gosh, what does he call her again in Captain? He describes his wife as my stale wife, yeah, and he says my thick kids. So it's not quite as dysphonistic about his wife, I don't think, but it is dismissive. Poems and jam, that kind of description of hers presents her as being quite homespun, not very glamorous, certainly not as glamorous as a thespian girl from the theatre, but yet she forgives him. And I think I read a sense of weakness into that the forgiveness isn't a strength of hers, but he views it as a weakness rather than holding him to account for what he's done. She simply kind of forgives and says that it's fine. And then I think a kind of contradictory description of her violent love, that seems to me to contradict a sense of homespun gentleness that you get in jam and poems. Now what I explore here is, rather than, you can make some notes on the kind of semantics of what we've just discussed there, but I'm interested in this. Her poems and jam, her forgiveness, her violent love. So that repetition of the third person pronoun, I think there's a kind of distance there between him and his wife. There's nothing, it seems kind of impersonal to describe her in that way. So I think, again, like with the poetic voice in Captain, there's a distance, a desire to distance yourself from the reality of your life. So he's attempting to live this other life, and this is the reality of his life, and yet he seems to try to distance himself from it. So he distances himself from his real life, and maybe that is a kind of rejection of the mundanity of his real life. If something's mundane, it's really boring and normal. So rejection of the mundanity of life. And then he says, and this is a life. And I think we can describe a pattern here between the repetition of that third person pronoun her, and then adding in the indefinite article, a life, because it's not my life, it's a life. And I think that does a similar thing. It distances himself. He's distancing himself from the reality of his life by saying it is a life. So I'm just going to say there that we've got a bit of a pattern of this distancing with that indefinite article. And that seems like a nice, neat bit of analysis. It's so similar to Captain. And then I want you to think about this next bit. He says, I print out, I print out. Now, why is he repeating I print out? And what do you think he's printing? Is it just the biography that he spent 5 years writing? Is that just what's been printed out on the computer? If so, why repeat it? Or do you think printing out could symbolise something else? And then he says, in all of your mirrors, my face, with its smallish, its quizzical eyes, its cheekbones, its sexy jaw, its talentless dust jacket smile. So, brief note, I'm going to combine the repetition of the third person its, and I'm going to include it in this idea of a pattern. So we've now got the pronoun her, the indefinite article a, and the third person pronoun its, all combining in this pattern, all distancing himself from his life and from itself. So when he's describing his face, it then moves to its. Is it almost as if the face doesn't belong to him? And also, going to think about this, think about your mirror's my face, and also this talentless dust jacket smile. So He's still, I think, here referring to when he was in Dickens' house and he was looking in his mirrors. So he was looking in the mirrors of Dickens and seeing his own face. So I'm interested in the juxtaposition of the two pronouns there, mine and yours. I think that's an attempt to bring himself closer to Dickens. So the juxtaposition of the pronouns physically in the poem close together symbolise an attempt for him to say, I'm just like you, or I want to be just like you. So symbolise the way he idolises Dickens. And then I'm going to finish off by thinking about this noun phrase, talentless, dust jacket, smile. So he ends the poem by describing his own smile as talentless and being symbolic of a dust jacket. Now, a dust jacket is the cover of a book. So you know, sometimes when you read a book, if you open up the left-hand cover, you often get like a picture of the author and describes a little bit about them, or maybe it's on the back inside cover, but it's on the dust jacket. So he's describing that kind of fake, like two-dimensional smile that obviously an author is going to put on their best smile for a photograph, but there's something disingenuous or not real about it. So he chooses to end the poem by describing himself as talentless and having a smile that is not real. There's something inauthentic about himself. So the poetic voice feels inferior and inauthentic, and essentially it just doubles down on this idea in the very last lines that he does not compare well to Dickens, that when he looks at his life, just like the poetic voice in Captain, he is dissatisfied with what he has achieved, particularly in comparison to his idol. Okay, that's it for the biographer. I hope you enjoyed that one. I like this one quite a lot.